Hello, and welcome back to the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center podcast series. Today we will pick up with part 2, where we left off with Dr. Corey Zoli discussing the socio-cultural understanding of the Af-Pak region. I've heard you mention mina several times, and I wanted to ask you about the interlocking pattern of crises that are faced by mina, as described by the Center of Strategic Studies and International Studies Chair in Strategy, Anthony Kordsman.
Yeah, Tony Kordsman has done, I think, a really great job. And first of all, keeping the region, the Af-Pak couplet, but also the broader region, the MENA region, really at the forefront of our critical thinking about U.S. foreign policy and security, global security issues, but also economic development and good governance. So he's, in my view, he's a really strong player in trying to keep this in our kind of the forefront of our mind and keep our attention focused on this in a way that's, helpful and productive, most especially for the communities, the nation states in the region. So his kind of claim in that study that I point to is that there's too much continuity. So he feels that in certain ways, those crises of problems of governance, rule of law, security, trying to find the right balance between religion and religious respect and appreciation, especially Pakistan, right, a religious state, right, and diverse religious communities, that those, as well as issues of economic underdevelopment and corruption and crony capitalism, all the things that we kind of mentioned, he feels that those problems from the past in those areas keep reappearing and reoccurring. And so that they actually build on each other, that the more that you don't resolve the fundamental roots for that creates tensions between communities, instead of embracing pluralism in your approach to governance, the more you create more problems of conflict. And the more that you don't resolve issues having to do with creating strong institutions while you rebuild a nation from war and conflict, as in the case of Afghanistan, then the more war and conflict you have, right? So this is his thesis, is that this kind of current instability of Afghanistan in particular, but also economic development in the case of Pakistan, that those things are kind of historical accretions. Like you're seeing history build upon history, build upon history. So this is his point, that you really can't understand what's going on now with Afghanistan struggling to become stable and well-governed, for instance, without looking at old historical crises and old factors and causes for instability. So I don't know if that gives you enough of the flavor for his analysis there. I think it's a very worthwhile approach to take a look at kind of patterns of instability, patterns of governance challenge, and patterns of conflict and war, and how those kind of beget more of the same. But at the same time, I would be slightly critical and suggest that, he doesn't Kordsman doesn't necessarily account for lots of important and interesting and good things from the perspective of those challenges, like good governance initiatives and good security initiatives, good policies that are trying to tamp down on extremism and insurgents inside, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Those things are all going on as well. I also think that he doesn't necessarily fully address the way in which the U.S. is playing a role. But I think it's partial. I think the way in which the U.S. and other nation states, including Europe, including the Gulf monarchies and others, have tried to support the region in economic development and good governance practices and developing legal and other institutions, universities and academic institutions, especially in Afghanistan. The way in which the U.S. has been one of the primary donors, aid donors on the security and military side for Pakistan. I mean, just, billions and billions of dollars spent in trying to help Pakistan and the government build their security capacity. So I think it's a little bit more complex picture, but I think Kordsman's concern about not letting historical crises just beget new crises is a very important point of view.
You've given us a little bit of an overview about the adaptation and response to these crises, how they affect both individual and group behavior of internal and external actors. But I heard you talk about the U.S. and the role that it plays in its relationship with this region. I would like to know how it's changed over time.
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I want to come back to what we talked about at the beginning, this Holbrooke and the Obama administration's notion of Af-Pak as a foreign policy strategy. And I think one of the most important elements in the administration after Obama, the Trump administration, I think there were some significant contributions that the advisors and the cabinet level members and the Secretary of State and others did, in fact, make in the region during the Trump administration. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in this region with the Biden administration. In the case of the Trump administration, one of the things that they did that I thought was a smart thing was to separate out Afghanistan and Pakistan. So they kind of decoupled the Af-Pak strategy. So it was no longer treated as one theater of operations. And I think that was pretty necessary to do for all the reasons that we've talked about, that there are just separate trajectories here. And it's very hard to just treat nations, especially ones that have such economic and security and governance challenges that are very, very different with very different causes and factors, not to mention cultures and histories and ethnic religious communities, etc. So I think it was smart to separate the strategy of engagement out so that it wasn't Af-Pak. Instead, it was, what's our South Asian strategy? What's our strategy for Pakistan? What's our strategy for India? What's our strategy for Afghanistan? What's our strategy in relationship to the Gulf states? And I think that the last administration wasn't necessarily focused as much on regional problems as regional solutions. And I think they knew they couldn't do everything. So I think they chose some issue areas that they thought that they could actually move the needle on. And I think that was peace building. And you saw that with the Abrahamic Accords, where, for the first time, we're seeing, peace agreements with the state of Israel, which is not, folks think, oh, okay, well, that's just Israel. It's not just Israel. It creates a stabilizing umbrella. It creates almost like an alliance system throughout the region so that when conflict triggers do occur, you've got a peace treaty already signed, sealed, and delivered so that you can do conflict resolution and dispute resolution to manage the challenges of that. And there always will be. Life is conflict, life is change, right? There will always be conflicts. There's going to be a pandemic, right? There's going to be a natural disaster. There's going to be an insurgent group that crosses boundaries, right? So you're always going to have stressors in the region. And so what was so important about revitalizing the peace accords, the peace agreements between Israel and other states is that it takes a big stressor, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, off the table, right? It brackets that as a stressor and trigger point, and instead it makes a kind of playing field, a landscape in the Middle East region where when there are additional stressors that come up, it doesn't have to be all about Israel versus Palestine, right? Folks can actually get together because they have an agreement and they can solve those problems that come up, including economic development or governance development for the PA, for the Palestinian territories and the Palestinian Authority. So I think that was a really significant win for the last administration, and it represents a big change. Starts, essentially saying if you don't make good on the the security priorities that are linked to this aid, we're going to pull the aid. And so that was, kind of a new approach, right? This is a new approach to the region, new approach to Afghanistan and Pakistan, very different from the Af-Pak strategy of the Obama administration. And, it's hard to tell yet what the outcome of that particular strategy will be. Some folks have said that it forced Pakistan's hands to get serious about good governance and to tamp down on some of the extremist actors having free reign in certain communities, in certain regions inside of Pakistan. I think those are the kinds of questions we can ask. What are the positive or negative effects tied to U.S. Policy intervention, whether it's aid, whether it's troops, whether it's diplomacy, whether it's training and support missions? So it looked to me that the shift was from military tool to economic tool.
And I heard you talk a little bit about China, so that kind of leads into my last question I have for you today. I'd like to wrap up by discussing how the Chinese and American peer competition affects this part of the world.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's like whatever the expression is, the $60 million question. This is the thing on everybody's mind. Everybody's concerned about it. I think the level of Chinese, so CCP, obviously make a distinction between China's government and the Communist Party that controls the government versus Chinese nationals and Chinese citizens. And that goes for everything I've talked about. I always make a distinction between governments and people, and that's a very important one to make. I think what you're seeing is how much China actually is playing a role in the world in ways that we probably were not aware of. Currency manipulation and, intellectual property theft and all the ways in which, essentially China goes about exfiltration, expropriation of U.S. high-tech and military tech intellectual property. And this has been going on since, the early 2000s, and we all know about it. But the way in which I think the last two administrations publicized that fact was very different. So I think the U.S. public, for better or worse, got a real education in how much action, often covert or subtle or cyber action, that the Chinese government undertakes. And so I think that increased Americans' awareness of how much peer competition in a very active way is actually going on between the U.S. and China, often behind the scenes. And so, academics have struggled with how to, the labeling mechanisms, like how we give names to this stuff, with the Cold War between Russia and the U.S. and other, U.S. aligned nations, right? I mean, it was a Cold War, right? It wasn't a hot war. There were lots of, kind of dirty little wars, we called them, or, border skirmishes and really some really terrible, wars, including in Afghanistan, right? Thinking back to Anthony Kordsman's point about the history. I mean, right? Russia, invaded and occupied Afghanistan in a way, and that was part of the Cold War. But so what kind of war is this? Maybe it's not exactly a war, but it is a very severe competition between the U.S. and China. Is it like that? Is it a Cold War? Is it a cyber war? Is it I think of it very much as a kind of information operations war, disinformation operations war. I think that component of it is enormous. And I think, China tries very hard when it competes with the U.S. to look like it's just offering an alternative model, when instead, behind the scenes, there's a lot of really careful, pointed, and targeted strategic thinking that really tries to, target the U.S. and other U.S. interests and allies in the places where they're most vulnerable economically, politically, even from a security perspective. So I think taking that framework in mind, you can see the kinds of moves that China is making in Pakistan, especially, right? It's trying to really secure that alliance. It's trying to create almost a sense of dependency between China and Pakistan. But it's also making overtures, throughout the South Asian and Middle Eastern region. So, we're hearing about, lots of back and forth between the Gulf monarchies, heading back and forth to China and working on various projects. You're hearing about support from China with a kind of economic charge to it in Afghanistan, right? So the way in which China is undertaking, like it did in the continent of Africa in many cases, trying to create economic development programs. You're seeing this especially with the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, where China is essentially using critical infrastructure investment and development in an enormously far-ranging way to try to reorient the whole Middle East and South Asian region to its advantage, right? Because once you invest in, poor nations' infrastructures, like, the Ghadar port, the deep water port in Pakistan, for instance, once you do that, and it creates these fancy leases where they're very hard for poor nations to make good on, and so they default, and so then China ends up owning or having more control or power or authority over that infrastructure, over that region in which they invested. So it's kind of a tricky way of doing economic development and aid and support, where there are some really significant power moves being undertaken in the process. But so I think you're seeing that kind of infrastructure development and economic aid and development as the tip of the spear for Chinese strategic thinking and planning. And that is occurring in the region we're talking about today, and in Afghanistan and Pakistan in particular. So that is a way in which there's kind of pure competition going on between, the U.S. and China, with direct impacts for our states under discussion today and for the region in general.
Well, Corey, thank you for sharing your insight with us today. I really appreciate you taking the time out. I know with everything going on right now, it's busy times.
You're very welcome, Amber. It's great to be here. It's funny because, we all talk to different kinds of communities, and I love your community because, first of all, it's very well informed. And, the folks who are involved in your discussion podcasts and, watching these, these podcasts and videos, they are in many ways leaders in the security arena. So their insights are really important, and their level of understanding and their ability to see around the corner on some of these issues is really, pretty unparalleled in terms of other communities. And so I always enjoy talking to you guys for that reason. And I always enjoy the feedback from your community when I do get a chance to talk to you. So thanks for having me.
This has been part 2 of the Socio-Cultural Understanding of the Af-Pak region. For more information, please visit www.hdIAC.org.